My name is Douglas, 67 years old. When my wife Margaret passed, I never expected what would happen next. After her funeral, my son Thomas offered to drive me to the airport. Instead, he took a detour down a dusty back road. Stopping suddenly, he turned to me with cold eyes. "This is where you get off. The house and business are mine now." As I stood watching him drive away with nothing but a small bag, something unexpected happened. I felt free. But Thomas had no idea what I had done before his mother died. If you enjoy real-life stories about betrayal and justice, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps share these life lessons with others who might need them. Margaret and I built our life together over 40 years. We met in 1979 at a small diner in Seattle, where she worked as a waitress. I was 21 then, just starting out as a carpenter, taking any job I could find. She had this way of smiling that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Within 6 months, we were married in a simple ceremony at her parents' backyard in Tacoma. We moved to Portland, Oregon a year later, when I found steady work with a local construction company. Margaret was smart with numbers and helped me track expenses, quotes, and payments. "Douglas, you know wood and nails. I know dollars and cents," she would say with that confident smile of hers. It was true. While I understood construction, she understood business. When our son Thomas was born in 1984, our little family felt complete. I can still remember holding him for the first time, this tiny human with Margaret's blue eyes and my square jaw. "He's going to be something special," Margaret whispered, and I believed her completely. As Thomas grew, so did our ambitions. By the time he started kindergarten, Margaret had convinced me to start my own construction business. Harris Construction began with just me and 2 other guys, taking on small renovation jobs around Portland. Margaret ran the office from our dining room table, balancing the books while Thomas played with his toys nearby. The business grew steadily through the 90s. We hired more workers, took on bigger projects, and finally moved operations to a real office building when Thomas was 12. Our specialty became high-end custom homes, and our reputation for quality and reliability spread throughout Oregon. By 2005, Harris Construction was handling multi-million-dollar projects, employing 30 people, and had become the dream we never thought possible. We built our own home too, a beautiful 4,000-square-foot craftsman-style house overlooking the Willamette River. Margaret and I designed every inch of it together. I can still remember the late nights at the kitchen table, drawing plans, arguing over window placements, and compromising on the size of the master bathroom. When we finally moved in, it felt like the physical embodiment of our marriage, something we had created together. Thomas was always bright but showed signs of entitlement early on. When he was 8, his teacher called us because he had taken another student's art project and claimed it as his own. "It looked better with my name on it," he told us, without a hint of remorse. Margaret always defended him. "He's just confident," she would say. "The world rewards confidence." As our wealth grew, I noticed Margaret changing too. The woman who once clipped coupons and made her own clothes started shopping at exclusive boutiques and collecting expensive jewelry. She redecorated our home 3 times in 5 years, each time more lavish than the last. I didn't mind the spending, we could afford it, but sometimes I missed the simple joy she used to find in small things. Thomas went to an expensive private university to study business, graduating with honors. When he returned to Portland at 23, it seemed natural that he would join the family company. I put him in project management, hoping he would learn the business from the ground up as I had. Looking back, I see the warning signs I ignored. Thomas took credit for his team's successes but blamed others for any failures. Clients sometimes mentioned his arrogance, but Margaret always smoothed things over with her charm. "He's young," she would tell me. "He'll grow into the role." We still had good times as a family. Thanksgiving dinners with too much food, summer vacations to our cabin on Mount Hood, Christmas mornings opening presents by the fireplace. Margaret was the glue that held us together. She translated between Thomas and me when tensions rose, making peace when our stubborn personalities clashed. Then came the day that changed everything. Margaret had been complaining about stomach pain for months, but refused to see a doctor. Just stress, she insisted. When she finally relented, the diagnosis was devastating. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The doctor gave her 6 months at most. I held her hand as we drove home in silence, both of us trying to process what this meant. Thomas was waiting at the house when we arrived, and when we told him, his first question was about the business. "Who's going to run things while you take care of Mom?" he asked. Not if I would take care of her, but who would run the business. Something in his tone made my skin crawl. The cancer moved faster than any of us expected. Within weeks, Margaret went from occasionally tired to bedridden. I immediately stepped back from active management of Harris Construction to care for her. Thomas stepped in to handle daily operations, something I was initially grateful for. "Focus on Mom," he told me. "I've got everything under control." I believed him because I needed to believe him. Our home transformed into something between a hospital and a fortress. Medical equipment appeared in our bedroom. Nurses came and went, and the peaceful sanctuary we had built together became a place of whispered conversations and beeping machines. I learned to administer medications, change sheets with Margaret still in the bed, and interpret the subtle changes in her breathing that signaled pain. Thomas visited every few days, always bringing expensive flowers, and spending exactly 45 minutes before claiming he needed to get back to the office. During these visits, he would pull out his phone and show Margaret photos of projects, contracts, and spreadsheets. "The Wilson project came in under budget," he would boast, or "We just landed the Riverside development." Margaret would smile weakly and tell him how proud she was. When he thought I wasn't listening, Thomas would whisper to his mother about company decisions, asking for her approval on changes I knew nothing about. Once, I overheard him say, "Dad doesn't need to worry about this right now. We can handle it ourselves." The "we" bothered me, as if I was already being excluded. About 2 months into Margaret's illness, our longtime accountant Sam Levin called me. "Douglas, there are some unusual transfers happening with the company accounts. Large sums, moving to new vendors I'm not familiar with. Thomas says it's for the Riverside project, but the numbers don't add up." I promised to look into it but got distracted when Margaret developed an infection that sent her to the hospital for a week. During that hospital stay, I arrived one morning to find Thomas sitting beside his mother's bed with a notary and what looked like legal documents. When I entered the room, he quickly gathered the papers. "Just updating Mom's insurance beneficiaries," he explained smoothly. Margaret seemed groggy, likely from the pain medication. That night, after Thomas left, I asked Margaret about the papers. "It's nothing to worry about," she said, her voice frail. "Thomas is making sure everything is in order for when I'm gone." When I pressed for details, she became uncharacteristically angry. "Can't you trust our son? He's looking out for our future, Douglas. For your future." As weeks passed, Thomas became increasingly distant toward me. His visits focused exclusively on Margaret, and he would often suggest I take a break, go for a walk, or get some rest while he sat with her. These moments alone with his mother seemed important to him, so I complied, using the time to shower or nap in the guest bedroom. One afternoon, I returned from a quick grocery run to find Thomas leaving in a hurry. "Mom's sleeping," he said, not meeting my eyes. "I have a meeting I can't miss." In the bedroom, Margaret wasn't sleeping but staring at the ceiling with a strange expression. When I asked if everything was okay, she simply said, "Thomas is taking care of things. That's what matters." While organizing Margaret's medications a few days later, I discovered a prescription bottle hidden behind her regular pills. The medication wasn't one her doctors had prescribed, and when I searched the name online, I found it was a powerful sedative typically used for severe anxiety or insomnia. Margaret had never mentioned anxiety issues, and her oncologist hadn't prescribed anything for sleep. When I carefully brought it up, she claimed her primary doctor had given it to her years ago, and she occasionally took one when she couldn't sleep. The bottle was dated 2 weeks earlier. Margaret's decline accelerated suddenly. The doctors had estimated 6 months, but just 4 months after her diagnosis, she slipped into a coma. 3 days later, she was gone. The night she died, Thomas was there, having arrived just an hour before. As the hospice nurse pronounced her death, I broke down in tears. Through my grief, I noticed something odd. Thomas was dry-eyed, checking his watch, already making calls about funeral arrangements. Margaret's funeral was an elaborate affair at Portland's largest cathedral. Though she had always told me she wanted something simple, Thomas overrode my objections. "Mom deserves the best," he insisted, though I suspected the real purpose was to impress the hundreds of business associates, clients, and local politicians who attended. The Harris Construction logo appeared prominently on the program, making the event feel more like a corporate function than a farewell to my wife. I was exhausted, having barely slept in the months of caregiving. The funeral passed in a blur of handshakes, condolences, and faces I barely recognized. Thomas positioned himself between me and most guests, smoothly intercepting conversations and steering people away after brief interactions. "Dad's not up for long talks," he would say with practiced concern, though he never actually asked how I was feeling. Thomas delivered a polished eulogy about Margaret's business acumen and contribution to Harris Construction's success. He spoke about her as a visionary and mentioned her role as a mother almost as an afterthought. When it was my turn to speak, I abandoned my prepared remarks and simply talked about the woman I had loved, her laugh, her kindness in our early struggling years, how she would leave little notes in my lunchbox when I worked construction. The personal stories seemed to make Thomas uncomfortable. At the reception afterward, I noticed something troubling. People approached Thomas with sympathy and business cards, speaking about projects and partnerships. When they spoke to me, it was with a strange deference, as if I was already a relic of the company's past. Several times I overheard variations of "Thomas says you're taking some time away from the business," or "Thomas mentioned you might be retiring." I had never discussed retirement with anyone. As the reception wound down, Thomas approached me with car keys in hand. "Dad, you look terrible. You need a break from everything. I've booked you a flight to Arizona. Remember how you and Mom always talked about visiting the Grand Canyon? You can stay at that resort you both liked. The flight leaves tonight." The offer seemed thoughtful, and in my grief and exhaustion, I agreed. Thomas led me to his black Audi, putting my small overnight bag in the trunk. I had packed it earlier at his suggestion, just some clothes and toiletries, plus a small framed photo of Margaret from our 30th anniversary. As we pulled away from the funeral home, I leaned back in the leather seat and closed my eyes, emotionally drained. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, we were no longer on the highway to the airport. Instead, Thomas was driving down a narrow country road I didn't recognize, tall pine trees flanking both sides. "Where are we going?" I asked, suddenly alert. "Just a short detour," Thomas replied, his voice unnervingly calm. The car slowed as we turned onto an unpaved road, dust billowing behind us. After about a mile, Thomas stopped the car and turned off the engine. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine. "Dad," he finally said, turning to face me, "this is where we part ways." I stared at him, not comprehending. "What are you talking about? The airport is at least 30 miles from here." Thomas's face hardened. "There's no flight, no resort. That was just to get you in the car without making a scene." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a document. "This is Mom's new will. She signed it 2 months ago. Everything goes to me. The house, the business, all the accounts." My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. "That's impossible. We had a joint will. Everything was supposed to be shared." "Mom changed her mind," Thomas said with a shrug. "She realized you were too old to handle things properly. The business needs young blood. She wanted to make sure her legacy was protected." "I need to talk to our lawyer," I said, reaching for my phone. Only then did I realize it wasn't in my pocket. Thomas held up my phone and wallet. "Looking for these? I took them while you were napping in the car." He placed them in his own pocket. "Here's the deal. You get out here. Take your bag. Start a new life somewhere else. If you try to contest the will or come back, I'll tell everyone how you neglected Mom during her illness, how you were mentally abusive, how you're suffering from early dementia. Nobody would believe that, I said, though uncertainty crept into my voice. They already do, Thomas replied coldly. I've been laying the groundwork for months. The sympathetic glances at the funeral, everyone thinks you're falling apart. The hospice nurses documented your exhaustion and occasional confusion. Mom's friends have heard all about how you couldn't cope with her illness. I felt sick. Why are you doing this? Because you never understood what the business could be, he said with sudden intensity. You were always satisfied with being small-time, doing quality work. He made it sound like an insult. Mom and I had bigger visions. Now I can make them happen without you holding us back. Get out, Dad, Thomas continued, checking his watch. I have a meeting in 2 hours with investors who actually understand ambition. Stunned, I opened the car door. Thomas reached across and grabbed my bag from the back seat, tossing it onto the dirt road. I stepped out, still trying to find words, to understand how my son could do this. Thomas looked at me one last time. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Enjoy your retirement, far away from Portland. With that, he closed the door, started the engine, and made a 3-point turn. I stood in the dust of the remote road, watching the car that carried my son and everything I had built disappear around a bend. No phone, no wallet, no way to call for help. I was 67 years old, alone on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, wearing the suit I had just buried my wife in. As the dust settled around me, the reality of my situation sank in. The temperature was dropping with the late afternoon sun, and I had no idea exactly where I was. Thomas had driven for at least an hour from Portland, possibly heading east toward Mount Hood, but I couldn't be certain. I was dehydrated from the funeral, where I'd barely eaten or drunk anything, and exhaustion from months of caring for Margaret weighed heavily on my aging body. Taking inventory of what I had, the results were dismal. The clothes I wore, the small overnight bag with 3 changes of clothes, basic toiletries, and the framed photo of Margaret. No food, no water, no money, no identification. At 67, this was not a situation I had ever imagined facing. First things first, I needed to find civilization before dark. Looking at the sun's position, I determined it was approximately 5 in the afternoon. That gave me maybe 3 hours of daylight. The sun was to my right and slightly behind me, which meant I was facing roughly north. Portland would be to the west, but without knowing how far east we had traveled, heading west blindly through dense forest seemed risky. The dirt road we were on had to connect to something eventually. I decided to follow it in the direction Thomas had driven, assuming it would lead back to a main road. My construction work had kept me physically active over the decades, but arthritis in my knees made walking painful, especially on the uneven surface of the rutted road. After about 30 minutes of steady walking, the trees began to thin, and I spotted what appeared to be an old hunting cabin set back from the road. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and a partially collapsed porch, but it represented shelter if nothing else. I approached cautiously, calling out to ensure no one was inside. Silence answered. The cabin was indeed long abandoned, with animal droppings on the floor and a musty smell that suggested years of neglect. But the roof was mostly intact, and the stone fireplace appeared functional. As I explored the single-room interior, memories surfaced that I had long suppressed. Before I was Douglas Harris, respected Portland contractor, I was Daniel Harmon, financial crimes investigator for the Treasury Department. In my 20s, fresh out of military service where I had trained in intelligence operations, I had worked on a case involving the Donovan crime family in Boston. My testimony had put 2 key members in prison, and the family had put a price on my head. The federal government had given me a new identity, relocated me to the opposite coast, and helped me start over. That was 45 years ago. The survival training from my military days came back to me now. I gathered wood for a small fire, found an old pot I could use to collect rainwater from a barrel outside, and fashioned a door barricade from broken furniture. As darkness fell, I sat by the small fire, contemplating how my past and present had collided in ways I never expected. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of a vehicle on the road outside. Tensing, I moved away from the fire, wondering if Thomas had returned. The headlights swept across the cabin as the vehicle slowed. Then a voice called out, "Hello? Anyone in there? Saw your fire from the road." I remained silent, unsure if this was help or more trouble. "Look, if someone's in there, I just want to make sure you're okay," the voice continued. "It's supposed to drop below 40 tonight. That fire won't keep you warm enough." Something about the genuine concern in the voice made me respond. "I'm here," I called back, "just taking shelter for the night." The man who entered was Native American, perhaps in his 70s, with long gray hair tied back in a ponytail. He introduced himself as Walter Blackfeather from the nearby reservation. "This old place has been empty for decades," he said, looking around. "You running from something or someone?" There was no judgment in his question, just practical concern. I decided a partial truth was best. "My son left me here after my wife's funeral today. Took my phone, wallet, everything." Walter studied me for a long moment, taking in my funeral suit, now dusty and wrinkled. "That's a special kind of cruelty," he finally said. "Come on. You can stay at my place tonight. Figure things out in the morning." I hesitated, but the alternative was a cold night in an abandoned cabin. I gathered my meager belongings and followed Walter to his pickup truck. During the 30-minute drive to his modest home on the reservation, Walter asked few questions but shared that he was a widower himself, his wife having passed 5 years earlier. "Grief makes people do strange things," he observed. "But what your son did, that's not grief. That's something else." At Walter's home, a simple but comfortable 2-bedroom house, he offered me a hot meal of venison stew and fresh bread. As we ate, I found myself sharing more than I intended, explaining about the family business, Margaret's illness, and Thomas's betrayal. I didn't mention my former identity, but Walter seemed to sense there was more to my story. "You don't strike me as a man who's beaten," he observed. Surprised, yes. Hurt, definitely. "But I see something else in your eyes. Planning." I nodded slowly. "I built that business from nothing. Spent 40 years creating something valuable. I'm not going to let my son steal it without a fight." Walter gestured to his landline phone on the wall. "You need to call someone? Friend who can help?" I stared at the phone, considering my options. There was one person who might still be alive, still remember Daniel Harmon. My old Treasury Department colleague, Franklin Pierce, had later transferred to the FBI's Witness Protection Program. If he was still alive, still in the system somehow, he might be my best hope. "Yes," I said, standing up. "There's someone I need to call. Someone from a long time ago." The phone rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Pierce residence." "I'm looking for Franklin Pierce," I said, my voice suddenly unfamiliar even to myself. "It's an old friend, Daniel Harmon." There was a long silence on the line. Then, "Nobody's used that name in a hell of a long time. How do I know you're who you say you are?" "Boston, 1977. The Donovan case. You had a scar on your left forearm from a fishing accident in Maine. You drank Jameson whiskey. Neat. You wore the same ugly green tie to court every day for luck." Another silence. "Jesus Christ. Danny Harmon. They told me you were probably dead by now." "Not dead," I replied. "Just transformed. I've been Douglas Harris for 45 years, built a construction company in Portland, had a family." "Had?" I explained my situation while Walter discreetly busied himself in another room. Franklin listened without interruption until I finished. "So your son left you stranded with nothing, thinking you're just a helpless old man who'll disappear quietly," Franklin summarized. "But he doesn't know who you really are. No one does. Not even Margaret knew until recently." This was the painful truth I had been avoiding. About a year ago, I found evidence She had gone through my private files. There was a box I kept locked in my workshop with my original birth certificate, some old photos, newspaper clippings about the Donovan case, with my real name carefully cut out. The lock had been picked. "Did she confront you?" Franklin asked. "Never directly. But she started making strange comments about secrets and trust. Then I noticed unusual calls on our phone bill to Boston area codes. When I checked her computer history, she had been researching the Donovan family and witness protection programs. You think she told your son? I'm not sure. But after she got sick, I found her speaking in whispers with Thomas. When I entered the room, they would stop talking immediately. And Thomas started making veiled comments about me not being who everyone thought I was." Franklin sighed heavily. "The program has evolved since your day, Danny. We have better protocols now, better support systems. But your case is so old, I'm not sure what kind of official help I can get you. I retired from the Bureau 15 years ago. I'm not looking for official help," I said firmly. "I just need to access some resources. Do you remember the contingency plan we created when I entered the program? The backup identities and the emergency fund?" Franklin sounded surprised. "That was unofficial, off the books. We weren't supposed to do that. But we did. And I maintained it all these years. Every decade, I updated the documentation, moved the money to new accounts. It was my insurance policy." "Smart man," Franklin said with what sounded like admiration. "Always were. So what do you need from me?" "A place to stay in Portland for a while. Contacts who can help me document what Thomas has been doing with my company. And maybe someone who still has access to federal databases." Franklin was quiet for a moment. "I have a condo in downtown Portland that I rent out. It's between tenants right now. You can use it. I know a few retired agents in the area who consult as private investigators. As for the databases," he paused. "My daughter works for the FBI field office in Portland. She doesn't know about you specifically, but she knows I helped people disappear in my career. She might be willing to run some discreet checks." "Thank you, Franklin. I'll need a ride back to Portland tomorrow if possible. Text me the address where you are. I'll arrange everything." He gave me his cell number to use from Walter's phone. After hanging up, I returned to the kitchen where Walter was making tea. "Got what you needed?" he asked simply. "Yes, more than I expected." I hesitated, then added, "There are things about me that aren't what they seem. Things I can't explain." Walter nodded. "Everyone has secrets. Some are just bigger than others." He handed me a mug of tea. "Get some rest. Tomorrow you start your journey back." That night, sleeping on Walter's comfortable guest bed, I reflected on the strange turns my life had taken. For decades, I had lived in fear that my past would catch up with me, that the Donovan family would somehow find Daniel Harmon hiding inside Douglas Harris. Instead, my own family had betrayed me, not because they had discovered my secret past, but because of greed and ambition. The irony wasn't lost on me. The skills and resources I had maintained to protect myself from old enemies were now going to be used against my own son. The thought brought no joy, only a grim determination. Thomas had made a critical error in his calculations. He thought he had abandoned a helpless old man on a remote road. Instead, he had unleashed something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and a lifetime of secrets to weaponize. 3 days later, I was settled in Franklin's downtown Portland condo, a modern one-bedroom unit with views of the Willamette River. Franklin had arranged for his daughter Jessica to pick me up from Walter's home. She was in her 40s, with her father's sharp eyes and no-nonsense attitude. She asked few questions during the drive, but I could tell she was assessing me, trying to reconcile the story her father had told her with the tired old man in a wrinkled suit sitting beside her. "Dad says you're one of his success stories," she finally said as we neared Portland. "Someone who built a completely new life." "I was," I replied. "Until a few days ago," Jessica nodded. "Dad also says you're not looking for revenge, just justice. Your father knows me well." "Good," she said firmly, "because I won't help with a revenge mission. But justice, That I can get behind. At the condo, I found that Franklin had already stocked the refrigerator, provided new clothes in my size, and left an envelope containing $5,000 in cash, a prepaid cell phone, and a key to a safety deposit box at a local bank. There was also a note: "The past stays buried unless absolutely necessary. Be careful, old friend." My first task was gathering intelligence. Jessica had provided me with the names of 3 former FBI agents who now worked as private investigators. I contacted Alan Wyatt, who specialized in financial crimes, explaining that I suspected my son of embezzlement and needed evidence. "Family business situations are always messy," Alan commented during our first meeting at a quiet coffee shop. "Especially when there's a death involved. People show their true colors when money and grief mix." I paid Alan a retainer from the emergency cash Franklin had provided. His first assignment was to discreetly investigate Thomas's recent business activities, focusing on the unusual transfers our accountant Sam had mentioned before Margaret died. Next, I visited the safety deposit box Franklin had given me access to. Inside, I found what I expected: documentation for my emergency identity. James Denton, 69 years old, retired financial consultant from Chicago. The Illinois driver's license had my photo, taken just 3 years earlier during my last update of the emergency contingency. There were credit cards, a social security card, and bank account information showing a balance of just over $800,000. This was money I had been setting aside for 45 years. Small amounts that wouldn't be missed from the business. Legitimate consulting fees I had earned on the side, all carefully documented for tax purposes, but kept separate from the family finances. It was my insurance policy, and now it would be my war chest. With my immediate financial needs secured, I turned my attention to Harris Construction. Using my James Denton identity, I rented a small office 3 blocks from the Harris Construction headquarters. I needed to understand what Thomas had been doing with the company since taking control. Through Alan's initial investigation, I learned that Thomas had fired Sam Levin, our longtime accountant, the day after Margaret's funeral. He had replaced him with a firm I had never heard of, Winston Financial. Alan discovered that the principal of Winston Financial, Edward Winston, had been a college roommate of Thomas's. This was the first red flag. I decided to reach out to former employees who might have information. Linda Chen had been our office manager for 15 years, before retiring the previous year. I called her, claiming to be a private investigator working for a concerned investor. "Something strange has definitely been happening at Harris," Linda confirmed during our meeting at her home. Before I retired, Thomas was already making unusual decisions, canceling long-standing contracts with reliable suppliers, bringing in new subcontractors nobody had heard of, paying premium prices for standard materials. "Do you think he was getting kickbacks?" I asked. Linda hesitated. "I shouldn't say this without proof, but yes. And there's more. The Riverside project? The big development that Thomas was so proud of? I saw the actual contracts. Harris Construction is taking all the risk, but most of the profit is going to a holding company called TR Investments. Any idea who owns TR Investments? Not officially, but Thomas and his college friend Ryan Taylor were always whispering about their side venture. I would bet good money that's what TR stands for. Thomas and Ryan. This information aligned with what Alan was uncovering. Thomas had been systematically looting Harris Construction, diverting funds to his own ventures, and setting up the company to take massive risks while shielding himself from the consequences. My next step was more direct. I contacted Jessica Pierce and asked if she could run background checks on Thomas Harris and Ryan Taylor. "I'm not looking for anything that requires a warrant," I assured her. "Just public records, known associations, any red flags." 2 days later, Jessica met me for coffee. "Your son has been busy," she said, sliding a folder across the table. 3 new companies formed in the last year, all with variations of the TR initials. Multiple large transfers to offshore accounts. And there's something else. She hesitated. Thomas has been making regular payments to a chemist who lost his license 3 years ago for illegally dispensing controlled substances. I felt a chill. The same period when Margaret started getting sick. Jessica nodded grimly. I can't prove anything, but the timing is suspicious. The payment started 6 months before your wife's diagnosis and continued until her death. The implication was clear but horrifying. Could Thomas have been slowly poisoning his own mother? The strange medication I had found, Margaret's accelerated decline, Thomas's complete lack of surprise or genuine grief at her death, all suddenly made terrible sense. With this new information, I contacted Franklin. I need more help than I thought, I admitted. This goes beyond embezzlement. I think my son may have murdered my wife to gain control of the company. Franklin was silent for a moment. That's a serious accusation, Danny. One that could expose your past if you pursue it. I know, but I can't let him get away with this. Not just for me, but for Margaret. Okay, Franklin finally said. I'll make some calls. But you need to be prepared for what happens if this goes public. Your witness protection status, your false identity, all of it could come out. After 45 years, do the Donovans still care about Daniel Harmon? I asked. The old man died in prison last year. His son runs things now. Different operation, more legitimate businesses as fronts. But they have long memories, Danny. Very long memories. I weighed the risks against the justice Margaret deserved. I'll take my chances. Thomas needs to be stopped before he destroys everything we built. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with Alan Wyatt and 2 forensic accountants to document every questionable transaction Thomas had made. Jessica provided information on the chemist, including evidence that he had been researching untraceable poisons that mimicked the symptoms of pancreatic cancer. Linda Chen connected me with other former employees who shared their own observations of Thomas's suspicious behavior. Finally, I was ready. Using my James Denton identity, I scheduled a meeting with Thomas at Harris Construction, claiming to represent a major investment group interested in partnering on the Riverside project. Thomas's assistant scheduled the meeting for 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after Margaret's funeral. I arrived at the Harris Construction offices, the building I had purchased 15 years earlier, now feeling like foreign territory. The receptionist, someone I didn't recognize, directed me to the conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see Thomas preparing for the meeting, arranging glossy presentation folders on the table. When I entered, Thomas looked up with his practiced business smile, which froze and then collapsed as recognition dawned. "Dad?" he gasped, half rising from his chair. "What are you? How did you?" "Hello, Thomas," I said calmly, placing my briefcase on the table. "Surprised to see me? Did you think I would die out there on that road? Or just disappear and never come back?" Thomas recovered quickly, his shock replaced by calculated confidence. "I don't know what you're talking about. We dropped you at the airport. You must be confused." He reached for his phone. "I should call your doctor. We've all been worried about your memory issues. Save it," I said, placing a thick folder on the table. "I have everything, Thomas. The embezzlement, the fake companies, the offshore accounts, the payments to Dr. Leland White, the chemist who lost his license." Thomas's face drained of color at the mention of the chemist. "You're making wild accusations. No one will believe you. You're just a confused old man who can't accept that Mom left everything to me." "That's where you're wrong," I replied, opening my briefcase and removing a small recording device. "I've been busy since you abandoned me. Very busy." I played a recording of Linda Chen, describing the fraudulent contracts. Then, another of Sam Levin, detailing the suspicious financial transfers. Finally, a statement from Dr. White himself, obtained by Jessica through methods I didn't ask about, admitting that Thomas had paid him to create undetectable toxins. Thomas's confident facade crumbled. "You have no proof I used anything on Mom. She was already sick. Her tissue samples are being tested as we speak," I lied, watching his reaction carefully. Modern toxicology can find traces of poisons months after death. Thomas lunged for the recording device, but despite my age, decades of physical construction work had kept me stronger than he anticipated. I caught his wrist, twisting it slightly until he gasped in pain. "Here's what's going to happen," I said quietly. "You're going to sign the company back over to me. You're going to confess to the financial crimes. And you're going to leave Portland and never come back." "Or what?" Thomas snarled, though fear had replaced the confidence in his eyes. "Or I give everything I have to the police, the FBI, and the district attorney. The evidence of financial fraud is irrefutable. The murder evidence is circumstantial, but compelling. At minimum, you'll spend 20 years in prison for the financial crimes alone." Thomas stared at me, searching for weakness, finding none. "You would send your own son to prison?" "You stopped being my son the moment you left me on that road," I replied evenly. "Maybe even before that, when you decided money and power were worth more than family." For a moment, I saw something like regret flicker across Thomas's face. Then it hardened into calculation. "I want immunity from prosecution, a settlement from the company, and my name kept out of any public statements. You'll get enough money for a fresh start somewhere far from here. Nothing more. And if you ever try to contest it or return, everything goes to the authorities." Thomas slumped in his chair, defeated. "I never thought you would fight back like this. Mom always said you were too trusting, too soft. Your mother never really knew me," I said quietly. "And neither did you." The paperwork transferring Harris Construction back to my control was signed that afternoon. Thomas emptied his office under my watchful eye, taking only personal items. The corporate attorney, shocked by the sudden change but professional as always, processed the documents without comment, though his curious glances spoke volumes. "Where will you go?" I asked Thomas as he prepared to leave. "Does it matter to you?" he responded bitterly. "No," I admitted, "but I want to know where not to be." A flicker of the little boy I had once loved passed across his face. "I have contacts in Arizona. I'll start there." He paused at the door. "Did you ever really love Mom, or was she just part of your cover?" The question struck deeper than he knew. "I loved her completely," I answered truthfully. "Which is why what you did to her is unforgivable." Thomas nodded slightly, a final acknowledgement, then walked out of the office and my life. The next weeks were a blur of activity. With Alan Wyatt's help, I unraveled the damage Thomas had done to the company, discovering that while he had diverted substantial funds, the core business remained sound. The Riverside project was salvageable with restructuring, and most of the questionable contracts could be terminated with minimal penalties. I reached out to Sam Levin, rehiring him as the company's accountant. "I knew something wasn't right," Sam told me during our first meeting. "Thomas claimed you had approved all the changes, that you were stepping back permanently." "A lot of people were told a lot of lies," I responded. "Now we start fresh." Jessica Pierce continued to help, using her FBI connections to quietly track the money Thomas had moved offshore. Much of it was recovered through legal channels, returned to the company without publicity that might have damaged Harris Construction's reputation with clients. The question of Margaret's death was more complicated. Without an autopsy, proving she had been poisoned would be nearly impossible, and pursuing that avenue would inevitably raise questions about my own past, potentially exposing my true identity. After long discussions with Franklin, I decided to let that particular truth remain buried with Margaret. Justice for her would come in other ways. 3 months after taking back control of Harris Construction, I made a decision that surprised many. I announced the company would be sold to an employee ownership collective, with profits shared among the workers who had helped build it. The sale would fund a new foundation in Margaret's name, dedicated to supporting pancreatic cancer research and providing assistance to caregivers of terminal patients. The Margaret Harris Foundation became my new purpose. Through it, I could honor the good parts of my life with Margaret, while creating something positive from the tragedy of her death and Thomas's betrayal. The foundation established a respite care program, providing relief for family caregivers and funded innovative research approaches that larger organizations overlooked. Franklin visited Portland for the Foundation's launch event. "You've done something remarkable here, Danny," he said as we stood at the reception, watching hospital administrators and research scientists network with potential donors. "Turned a personal tragedy into public good." "It helped me heal," I admitted. "Gave me a reason to keep going." "Have you thought about what's next for you?" "Douglas Harris has a public profile now with the Foundation. That increases the risk of exposure." I nodded. "I've considered that. But after 45 years, I'm tired of looking over my shoulder. Daniel Harmon was a young man doing his job. I'm not ashamed of what he did." "And if the past comes calling?" Franklin asked. "Then I'll face it," I replied simply. "I'm too old to run anymore." In the year that followed, I moved from Franklin's condo to a smaller house near Mount Hood, similar to the cabin Margaret and I had always talked about building for retirement. I reconnected with old friends, made new ones, and even started dating again, something I never expected at my age. Barbara, a widow I met through a foundation volunteer program, brought laughter back into my life in ways I had thought were gone forever. I visited Margaret's grave regularly, placing fresh flowers and sitting in quiet contemplation. "I should have seen what was happening with Thomas," I told her during one visit. "Should have protected you better." I was so focused on my old enemies that I missed the danger within our own home. Walter Blackfeather became an unexpected friend, visiting Portland occasionally and staying at my house. "Being abandoned on that road saved you," he observed during one of his visits. "If Thomas had left you in your comfortable life, you might never have discovered what he did, never found your strength again." He was right. The road where Thomas left me thinking I would disappear had instead led me back to myself, to the core strength and resilience I had forgotten I possessed. In losing everything, I had found freedom from the fear and complacency that had defined my later years with Margaret. I never heard from Thomas again, though Jessica occasionally updated me on his whereabouts, tracked through financial transactions and social media. He had indeed gone to Arizona, then Mexico, living on the money I had provided in our settlement. Sometimes I wondered if he ever thought about what he had done, if he felt remorse for poisoning his mother or abandoning his father. Mostly, I tried not to think about him at all. The foundation flourished, expanding its programs and gaining national recognition. At the 2-year anniversary gala, I was asked to give a speech about resilience and new beginnings. Standing at the podium, looking out at the faces of people who had come together to create something meaningful from tragedy, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected to find again. "Life rarely follows the path we expect," I told the audience. "Sometimes we lose everything we thought defined us, our possessions, our relationships, even our identity. But in that stripping away, we discover who we truly are beneath the labels and roles we've accumulated. And sometimes, we find we are stronger, more resilient, and more capable of growth than we ever imagined." What I didn't say, what I could never say publicly, was how literally this applied to my own journey from Daniel Harmon to Douglas Harris, and back to some integration of both. The secret past that had once been my greatest vulnerability had ultimately been my salvation, providing the resources and skills I needed when everything else was taken from me. As I stand today, looking back on the road that brought me here, I realize that freedom comes in many forms. Sometimes it arrives as a cruel abandonment on a dusty road, sometimes as the courage to face a painful truth, and sometimes as the simple decision to stop running from the past and instead embrace all the parts of yourself, both hidden and known. Have you ever faced a moment when everything you thought you knew was stripped away? When betrayal forced you to rediscover who you truly are beneath the roles and relationships that defined you? Share your story in the comments below. And if this tale of resilience and redemption resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that even our darkest moments can lead to unexpected freedom. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, it's never too late to reclaim your life and start again.